Great. Welcome, Stani, Brenda, Ahnaf. It's great to be with you. I'm really excited to pick your brain on a really exciting topic, and that's decentralized social media. And Ahnaf, you might be too young to remember this, but back in 2017, there was a lot of excitement around decentralized social media. We were always wondering, what's the next use case for blockchain technology? Despite all of the hype at the time, DSM didn't really take off. So I'd like to ask, what were the shortfalls for decentralized social media, and why didn't it live up the hype during the previous ICO boom? Maybe, Stani, we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, and happy bear market, everyone. I think if you go back in time in 2017, there's definitely attempts of building some sort of social media on the blockchain, and I think kind of like the challenges there were that we're still early on the utilization in the blockchain technology itself. But most importantly, the focus has been back in those days on the value cycles. So essentially, how do we create a social media where the users are getting paid for content and publishing and focusing more of the crypto economical side? Because one of the things that blockchain provided is not only the distributed ledger, but also the crypto economics. So in that sense, when we look more today and what's happening in the Web3 space, naturally from Bitcoin and thinking blockchain in general, we started to solve financial challenges. And from Bitcoin, we then started to have actually a composable decentralized financial ecosystem, thanks to, for example, for Ethereum and having this virtual computer running on the blockchain. So you could essentially create different kinds of applications. And after we have this very amazing decentralized finance ecosystem built, we've seen the innovation going to the next interesting things. And now we had a lot of expansion with the NFTs, which was quite fascinating because creators could go directly to the community. And now with Web3 Social, I think the big difference is, as we look at all the action that is happening in the Web3 space, is that it's mainly about the ownership. So where back in a few years ago, when it was about creating value, today it's more about creating ownership for the users, about the protocols that they're using all the time, or products they're using frequently. And where decentralized finance was able to bring the ownership to the users for financial applications and decide how they're built in the future and have this direct interaction in a non-custodial fashion. Web3 Social now is about, for us at Aave and building the Lens protocol, is about owning your profile, the relationship with your audience, and being able to post content directly to your audience and changing that structure and not being locked in a particular platform. And I think it's more now about that, the ownership concept.
Excellent. Brenda?
Sure. So I think when you look at the way that Web3 has evolved in that particular space, I think you have a piece there when you're talking about ownership and community. I think when you're talking about within a Web2, there was almost this uncertainty. People didn't have a trust around blockchain. And in order to get that mass adoption and get people to want to be involved in the community, there needs to be that level of trust. And that's why as we come into Web3 and as we're building, if there's that trust of the idea sort of around blockchain and they have a little bit of an understanding, then it kind of grows with the community. And that's where the concept with NFTs and the ownership and having DAOs and having that piece of that community and feeling like you belong within it, you need that trust element first. And I think that's why we're starting to see it sort of start to build, is because there's this level of trust within it, and that's where people are comfortable with coming in and owning a piece of that and being part of the community.
Yep. And then although I do agree with the points made by Stani and Brenda about ownership and trust, however, I do believe that in order for a DSM to actually be viable, it needs to have some sort of edge over the current status quo. So although blockchain and Web3 technology is a big improvement over the current Web2, not a lot of people would actually really understand the back end very well. For example, take email. All we do is we understand the core value prop of email. So instead of having to send mail over 2 weeks, it gets sent in 2 seconds. However, that's exactly how we should be marketing DSM. We shouldn't be talking, or at least I believe that we should be talking somewhat about the back end and how Web3 technologies work, but it also has to be better than the status quo. We cannot create a Web3 Twitter with it being functionally and UX-wise worse than Twitter. It can be like technically much better than Twitter, but it has to actually work and function. You have to be able to talk to your friends. You have to be able to work with the network effect in order for a DSM to actually work.
Well, you've used the word Web3 a few times already, and in terms of industry buzzwords, there's no buzzword greater than Web3. Everyone's talking about it, unless you're Jack Dorsey and you're on Web 5 already. But so I'd like to ask you, maybe Stanley to begin, how do you demystify Web3? Like actually explain the nuts and bolts of what Web3 actually means and how it applies to DSM.
Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of like it's easier to go back in time and think about like we're building here an internet, but it's a bit different kind of an internet where we used to. And when we think about, for example, Web 1, it was about being able to read, and then Web 2 is read and write. And the way we see is that Web 3 is read, write, and own. And that's the significant difference. So in Web 1, for example, there was internet where you have a lot of content in a way of creating accessibility to information globally. And that's amazing, kind of like a beautiful concept that has been going for quite a long time. And it democratizes the information, accessibility to information for everyone, and then the ability to be able to contribute, which was the idea of Web 2, is that you can actually go and easily create content and share it with your audience. But in many cases, when you are actually doing that, so when you're using the bigger tech platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and let's say TikTok, you're actually creating the value for the platform itself. So you're creating content, you're consuming content, and you're providing a lot of data. And when you're doing that, at the same time, you're essentially feeding that infrastructure. And you kind of like, as a user, you become a product, because essentially the platform sells you different kinds of services and tries to figure out what do you like and don't like, and what is your interests, and they create a business out of it. And Web3 is about more that thinking that all these protocols that we're creating, whether they're financial or social, they're so important to the humanity and everyone that is using that they should be public goods, meaning that the code bases should be public and open source, but on top of that, also that everyone can actually come and use those protocols and contribute, and on top of that, have the ownership aspect. And that means that you can actually go and decide, let's say, how these protocols should be evolved in the future, what is important, how the content moderation should work, and have this accessibility yourself. And when it comes to Web3 social, I think the key is that you should be able to actually own your profile itself and the audience that you have with your community. And that means, if one application goes down or it's being developed in a way that you're not very excited about that, you could actually go to another application without losing your audience and being able to make that digital exit, actually. And the interesting part with the Web3 communities is that if you don't really anymore enjoy one particular community, if something happens, you can also fork the code and create a new protocol and a new community. And that's what has been happening in open source technology for decades now. If you look at the Linux ecosystem and different distributions they, for example, has. And that's how the innovation thrives. And it's all about democratizing access and participation for the future of the internet, in my opinion.
Excellent.
I love that. So as a marketer, as a CMO, I look at Web 1, 2, and 3 in very simple terms. So Web 1 is simply, here's my business, this is what I do, I'm presenting it to you, you can read about it. End of story. Web 2 is, this is my business, this is what I do, tell me what you think, and I'll decide which one of those I'm going to share with the public, and I'll decide kind of how to do that. And you tell me everything about you, and then I'll let you know what I want to do with that information. Web 3 is a space where you have to ask your community to join what you're doing, and that community gets to own a piece of what you are and who your brand is. So rather than them just saying this is what we are, or them deciding whether or not you can have your say, Web3 gives you the opportunity where it's putting the power back into the hands of the individual user to be part of that community and own a piece of that brand. So from a marketing perspective, it's an entirely new way of how you need to look at the community that you want to build and the people, the users that you have, because now they have more control into how they're coming in, and you have to have an entirely different way of looking at it. And it's from a social media, like from a social perspective of what that means, it means that you have to have an authentic voice with your users, and you need to let those users speak about your brand and own a piece of it in order for that to, work in today's marketing space. So that's why I think Web3 is fascinating. It's an entirely new way of looking at how you can speak with your brands and your users.
Yeah, so totally echo Stani and Brenda's thoughts. And from a teenager's perspective, Web 1 is something that happened way before our time. We weren't even born yet. And Web 2 is what's happening currently. We have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all these different social medias, especially TikTok, which are kind of governing our lives right now. The way that we think, the way that these algorithms play out, they really do govern what we do, how we think, what we talk about, especially in high school. Web3, in my mind, is exactly what's going to change that. The issue is, though, when we see NFTs, which is the only way that teenagers really think about Web3 right now, we think of like a scam. We think of that it's a really big Ponzi scheme. Now, the issue is, of course, how do we demystify it? And of course, it's going to be education. So like Coinbase's Learn to Earn program is very great, as of course teens want money, we're all broke, but also it's just a really great way to incentivize people to learn in general, right? So in terms of social media, teens likely wouldn't care too much about, of course, the back end is that we'd get to own our own data. However, eventually they probably would, as we can see the ripple effects of having aligned economic incentives where instead of course, you guys have probably heard the phrase of when the product is free, you are the product. Teens have been a product for their entire life. So I would love to see what happens when the script is actually flipped, where they are not the product anymore and teens can just have their own real estate in their head again.
So in terms of decentralized social media adoption, I see two factors. One factor is there seems to be a loss of trust in centralized platforms like Facebook, et cetera. The Cambridge Analytica scandal is an example of that. In addition to the value that it brings, that Web3 DSM brings. So do you think that decentralized social media can ever replace the centralized models, or will it actually coexist alongside, or will we see Facebooks and Instagrams actually apply more DSM principles?
I think maybe I will see like a bit of like parallelism. So you have obviously like the social media companies are, they're the biggest companies in the planet. So it's definitely like hard to compete in same level. But I think decentralization as a movement is something that is growing slowly, and it's more about the movement of ownership as well. So the more users are creating, let's say, lens profiles over a period of time and getting excited about new applications that are built in decentralized social media, and essentially without so think of this, if you want to build a decentralized social media application in the future, you as a developer, you don't need to recreate the platform effect, and the Web3 social media has been built for those platform networks. So you want to have your profile on Twitter because, let's say, the whole crypto Twitter is there talking about topics that are interesting for you, and you want to be in TikTok because there's a lot of creators and you follow the content, and there's things you want to talk with your friends, for example. And same with Instagram. So those networks are established pretty well, and it's kind of like hard to break that barrier. But I think what breaks the barrier is that when you have more and more users that are actually creating profiles, and they have the ownership to their audience and friends, and they're not specifically tied to one particular application. And you see a lot of developers coming in and being able to actually build those new social media applications without creating that platform effect. And when you have something like decentralized social graph, it means that every single application these developers are creating, they're feeding to the same social graph. Essentially, all the other applications are benefiting from that network effect. And if you think about it even further, Ethereum is a big social graph itself, because there's sort of transactioning, and you have all these layer 2s like Optimus, Metis, and Arbitrum that are also creating transactional data. And all this data is a graph itself. So essentially, when you create a new application on top of Ethereum, you are able to have this composability across all the other applications and data. And I think that's the way to build these social media applications very fast. And also, it democratizes the access for developers to build a completely new ways to interact with the content, because anyone, any part of the world can build a new application and just focus on specifically on that experience layer without building that big platform network effect. And just going not much back in time, if everyone remembers Clubhouse, there's a lot of effort that the whole team and the ecosystem went through to actually create that Clubhouse big network effect during COVID. And that just is one example how hard it is to create a network. But if all these applications, they come together and build a network together, and then let the application developers and the users decide how to curate and what algorithms to use, like the end benefit is basically users having more choice and options, and they can basically use those new applications without losing their follower relationships in one particular platform. And I think, end of the day, if the technology works very well, and if there's a lot of adoption, I think the bigger social media companies, they will follow in some particular way, in my opinion.
Maybe you won't get banned from Twitter for a day or two, right?
That's a good example. So the way I got banned, I basically said that I'm the new CEO of Twitter, which is, of course, like a joke.
Yeah.
And it's just an example where I lost connection to my audience for a short period of time. But now I'm back in Twitter as the CEO of Twitter.
I also think that Sam actually raises an interesting point. So Stani obviously got banned from Twitter for a couple of days, and Stani was actually lucky enough to use his audience's voice to get him unbanned. However, when we're building decentralized social medias, how do we know how to govern? There was this other social media back in 2017, I forgot exactly what they were called, but what they built was these user-governed forums where they're all kind of siloed, but they were very poorly, they built off of each other kind of, but they're really just big user silos, very similar to 4chan for some reason. So obviously it didn't work, but when we're trying to govern ourselves, how can we actually do that? Because of course you can all try and set your own rules, but especially with Web3 has this issue of not having. The great thing about centralization, or at least one great thing about centralization, is that there's obviously a clear vision. However, with Web3, one of the pitfalls of decentralization is that there's not enough clear of a vision of what's right and what's wrong. Or a lot of Web3 people think that Stan should have never got banned in the first place. However, Twitter has some regulations to uphold, and that's obviously why they did what they did. When we're building DSMs, the line becomes very blurry, what becomes right and what becomes wrong, and there's no real clear way as to how are we going to be able to build a DSM, which actually does make sense, which is where I see a lot of friction coming from Web2 users who might potentially get harassed on a free speech forum where it just turns into something that's potentially negative.
Brenda?
To be honest, I think there's always going to be a platform where I can share pictures of my kids and my dog and share them with my friends. I don't think that's ever going to go away. I always think there'll be platforms where brands can come in and talk about new things that are happening and keep everybody up to date. That's not going to go away. I don't think these are going to go away. I think what is going to change is the way that they interact with their users, and they're going to have to change. Because at some point, I mean, I might go on Facebook to connect with my friends, but my kids certainly don't. and my husband might use Twitter for certain things, but I don't. So everybody's got sort of their different one that they're working with and their different socials, and that's not going to change. But the way that they interact is, and I think you're going to see a lot more feedback coming from building communities within them. I think there's going to be more levels of anonymity that comes around. Not everybody wants to know everything about everybody. I think that's going to change a bit too. So I don't think they're going anywhere, but I think they're going to have to change with the times.
Absolutely. So if DSM is here and if Web3 is enabling it, are we going to see the rise of social tokens? And how would social tokens actually power different decentralized social networks?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of social tokens. Kind of like I just hate the idea where you see your like personal market capitalization and seeing it going up and down like crypto markets. It just like feels very not very exciting idea for me. But I could see them as maybe like an idea for example, for creators that have a creator brand in some existence. And I'm more excited about kind of like the idea of like having, let's say, an NFT that represents what you are providing to the community, or for example, that anyone can actually follow you some way and have that relationship with you. So that's something that we build into the Lens protocol in the way that every single follow is actually a minted follow NFT. And whenever you post new content, those follow NFTs will reflect the latest content. So you kind of have this dynamic NFT and a bit of a permissionless communication channel for your audience. And then you can essentially even create a lot of interesting things as a creator. So you could decide maybe I want to actually share this content between my followers between 1 to 100 token IDs, and maybe they have to have also a specific NFT, let's say a Crypto Coven or some other PFP in their address, and then they can basically see my content or mint an NFT of my content. And that's the way you can engage with your community and build on that. And by the way, I think it's kind of like also a bigger picture, a part of the bigger picture of Web3, so Web3 Footprints. So whatever we do on the blockchain, we kind of like create this interesting social footprint. And it's very common that when you have different kinds of projects coming out in the Web3, you could actually use that data to reward your community. And this is what we have been doing with Lens Protocol. So it's been on mainnet for a bit over a month now. And the team has been listing different communities that, based on their interactions in the Web3, that they can join into the community. And also, last thing I want to say is the soulbound tokens are quite fascinating, where you can actually mint tokens that are in your address, but you can't actually move them away. So it's kind of like a on-chain tattoo, or like some sort of like an on-chain identity that you can build on top. So that's also like a fascinating idea brought by Vitalik.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a question for me. We literally built a platform that rewards with tokens for taking part in communities, right? So, do I think that social tokens? Absolutely. I think that's where it's heading. I think that any brand, any organization, any company, they want to reward their communities for taking part. They're going to give them tokens that they can turn around and trade those in for NFTs or memberships, and that's like obviously that's what I built. That's where I believe it's going, and I think that's what you have to do in order to gain a loyal community and keep it. Then you need to reward them with social tokens. It's a good way to keep them engaged and reward them for their loyalty and interest in your brand.
Yeah, I think social tokens are actually very interesting in terms of the potential that they really have. There's one funny application, I forgot exactly who did this, but there's someone who split their life up into 100,000 tokens, where the token holders all voted on every single decision that this person made in their life, from choosing what job they would get to having a vasectomy, which is completely wild, which obviously that's dumb, you probably should never do that. But in terms of more practical applications, it could be the future of crowdfunding, where I believe there's this artist, probably programmer, who fundraised for a trip to go to the Bay Area, where the agreement was that he would raise $30,000 and each token holder would have like 15% of his income airdropped to them, where that is a very innovative way to raise capital and then use it to actually provide value to several thousand people just because of they believe in you, your vision, and what you can potentially do to help the world. So yeah, I think there's so much potential.
Excellent. Well, we have less than 2 minutes. I want to take a poll. Who here owns crypto? And who's down more than 70%? So I just wanted to ask you guys, what's your take on the current market conditions? Any words of wisdom or any thoughts or considerations?
Well, it definitely, I mean, in crypto, you have market cycles, so that's something I'm personally used to, and it's not the first cycle I've been in. But we've been always very interested about the technology itself and building the future internet. And at the same time, to some extent, I also think that like the idea is that the more we build utility into the blockchain and Web3, the more people need to care about coming into the Web3 by buying an asset and supporting a particular project, but they can actually, maybe a year from now, most of the people that come to Web3 actually come by minting a Web3 social media profile. And then the markets become less relevant when it comes to kind of like being part of the larger tech community.
Well, you know what? I got 3 kids. I gave each of them $5 to play with on crypto. And one of them traded every second for 3 days. The other one did nothing. And they both ended up with the same amount of money at the end of the day. So you know what? If you can hold, then you hold. It's just like any other market. I think it'll bounce. I think it'll be fine. You just got to keep with it.
I think this just affects the startup ecosystem and everyone who might not have the best premise or not very solid footing on the ground. This is where markets really come into play.
Good. We'll leave it at that.